Welcome to Beyond the Surface. We highlight unique voices in architecture and design. We share their stories to uncover who they are beyond the surface. Hi, I'm your host, Alex Sanchez. Today's episode is Behind the Mic with our co founder, Caleb Kwok. We're excited for this episode because it is the first time we've ever really talked about the story behind the podcast and behind why we started Beyond the Surface. We thought it would be a great way to end the year off this way, and we're excited to start this episode, so let's get it started. So let's tell you a little bit about Beyond the Surface and what it is. Caleb, would you like to start?
So, Beyond the Surface started when we were both architecture students at IIT. We were third year architecture students, and that was in 2023. So, we were interested in really just understanding architects, and Alex can tell more about it, especially since she came up with the idea and came to me about it. But yeah, we started in 2023 as students, and we've continued it since, even after our graduation, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about what the podcast is, why we wanted to do the podcast, starting the podcast, and watching it grow over time. So, yeah, the podcast is about 3 years now. We didn't know we were going to necessarily do this after we graduated, but before we get there, let's talk a little bit about why we started this podcast. I know in the past episodes, I've mentioned that I am a first generation college student, or was a first generation college student. I recently graduated this May and became the first person in my family to ever get a degree at a university. But in order to really understand why this podcast became so important to me, goes a little bit further back. When I was born, my parents were teenagers. They were very young and they were never really together. So I pretty much spent my time like going from house to house. But around the time when I was 8, my mother married. And when she married, I lost all contact with my father. And unfortunately, this is where the abuse began. So it became a really tough environment to live in, very abusive and very, very strict. And I pretty much grew up in this household. They did a lot of construction, which is what sparked my interest in architecture. And then once I was 16, things would become a lot worse. So it became a little bit more dangerous. It was more abusive. So around this time, I became more serious about what I wanted to do in my career. I already knew I wanted to do architecture. I already knew I wanted to go to college, but college felt like a dream for me that was so far out of reach. I never thought I was actually going to get there. And during this time, my household wasn't doing super well. I never really talk about this, but I almost didn't finish high school. My mother, they my mother was kicking me out at the age of 16 of my house. And so I was soon to end up without a home. And they also knew education was very important to me. I had really good grades, and I mean, I was the oldest of, well, I'm an oldest of seven, but in that household, I was oldest of five. So I had a lot of responsibility ever since I was a child. And I remember the day that they went to, and I remember that during this time, it was a very bad environment to be in because I was growing up and starting to get my own ideas. It became a lot more dangerous for me to be in this home. And they also didn't want me around, so I was getting kicked out. And they left me with the choice of, and at one point they said that if they kicked me out, they would also take me out of school since I would no longer be under them. And I remember during this time, me and my sister were in communication with my father. We had finally been able to contact him, and we were planning on moving or trying to move in with him, um, most likely when the summer came around. So, especially since I was still in school at the time. And my father lived in Seattle at this time too. And I remember the day that they took me out of school. They withdrew me out of school. And this was going to be my last day of school forever. I had just taken the ACT. I had all these hopes and they were just going to go down the drain. And I was just like, this can't be like this. And we called my father, and me and my sister ended up running away to Seattle. We told, and I love my father so much. Like, During this entire process, he got full custody of us and he really pushed us towards our dream. He pushed me towards my dreams, towards what I wanted to do. I only had about a year and a half to make up for everything I hadn't done. I had kept my grades very well, but I was missing things like extracurriculars and organization internships, building that resume, and he really pushed me to get some internships. He really pushed me to learn how to network, communicate, present myself, open a LinkedIn. He pushed me so that I could be able to get into college because he knew that that's what I wanted to do. And so when I finally came to IIT, flying all the way from Seattle to Chicago, it was just the most amazing thing that could ever happen. I had finally accomplished my dream. But unfortunately, I had not prepared myself for anything after that. College was just a dream that I never thought I could achieve. And upon achieving it, I didn't know what to do afterwards. I didn't know what came afterwards. And I remember like sitting in lectures and seeing all these really famous architects being excited every single time I saw someone speak. And I was like, how do I get from here to there? I remember when I first came to IIT, I tried to find the best community that I could, and the one that I could relate to the most was NOMAS, the National Organization of Minority Architects. It's the student chapter here at IIT, and I remember that's where I started my community. I put all my work that I had done with my father into practice. I started networking. I started doing things in leadership, and I worked my way up to professional development chair towards my third year. And during this time, I was helping with events, I was helping organize panels, and really understanding the value of all of this starting to come together. But it still left me with the question, how do I get from where I am right now to the architects that I see online? What is the story behind the work that they do? The architecture they do is amazing, but what is behind the person, the story of the people who are doing the work that I want to do in my future? And so I remember just thinking, what if we had some type of way to communicate this so that people can really learn about it? And maybe we interviewed people, something. And that's when I eventually came to Caleb and I was like, what if we made a podcast? I don't know how we're going to do it. The people at Nomas seem to support me, but they also don't know how to do it. And they said that I'll have their full support if I can figure this out. Would you like to do it with me? And so that's for me how the podcast started and a little bit about why I wanted to do the podcast. What about you, Caleb?
So I'll jump back and talk about my background as well. So I grew up in Iowa City, Iowa, which is a college town. It's where the University of Iowa is. That's a university that doesn't have an architecture program, but in state at Iowa State, there was an architecture program. So growing up, I really liked creative works like artwork. My father's a musician, so even music. But one thing that I always thought about is how is artwork or design actually helping people? I remember looking into engineering and one specific college visit I did with my parents. I spent the whole car ride home telling them why I realized architecture was right for me. And it boiled down to the fact that sometimes I felt like engineering was too invested in numbers or optimization, where architecture actually had a function for people in the design. So that was one thing that pushed me. And then entering college, it was a strange time because it was COVID. So we had basically lost senior year or the second half of it, and we entered college in 2020 in August, so the fall semester. And around that time, it was hard to really get to know people aside from maybe our year. So I didn't get involved with student orgs until second and third year. And similar to Alex, I started taking networking very seriously between second and third year. And I also happened to be working on campus that summer. So when the AIA conference was here in Chicago, they hosted an event at Crown Hall, and I was able to go. And I realized that I was able to talk to people and network, but really having conversations with people was tough. I mean, I was still young, but part of what I really wanted to do was get to know people and understand how I would become one of those award winning people or get invited to these events where I could be somebody that is doing work that helps people. I always enjoyed listening to news or podcasts as just a way to get information. And when Alex brought up the idea of having a podcast, I really liked it because for me, it was a good way to tell stories. I always felt like as I got involved with AIS and NOMAS, I saw that some students didn't always have the time to attend events, or they might not care enough if they have to physically take the time out of their days. But some students really do care, and if we could record something, I thought a podcast would be the perfect way to actually get the content shared. You could share it later on, and 1 or 2 years later, somebody could find it and listen to it. So it wasn't restrictive to somebody's time. And as long as somebody was interested in learning, they could go and find something. And another side of it is my parents immigrated to the US from Hong Kong. So a lot of my extended family is also from Hong Kong, and they live there or they've moved away. But one thing that I've always thought about is growing up, I wanted to be able to tell their story somehow. Like car rides with my parents, I would talk to my dad about my family. And it was always something that I thought about, oh, what if I could record this? And even though I'm not recording my family in these podcasts, I get to talk to guests that do talk about their family. They talk about their stories, their journey. I found that a lot of our guests also have an immigrant parent or a story about how they immigrated to the US. And that really resonates with me. So when Alex brought up the idea of the podcast, I was really excited to really tell the story of people. We've already met so many people, so why don't we get it so that their stories heard from other students?
I really liked what you said about choosing a podcast to be the way that we record. I remember when you were talking about wanting students who couldn't necessarily always attend those events to be able to listen to those things. I think that was a huge driver to why we chose a podcast over the different medias that we could have done. When it came to the podcast, I remembered that during the time, well, I was working two jobs at the time. So I also couldn't always attend these events. Or sometimes some of my classes were later during the evening since I had to work. Also, another reason why I couldn't attend these events. And we had a lot of friends who were in the same situation where a lot of students were working a lot, not being able to attend these events, or simply too burnt out at the end of the day, so they couldn't always focus on these lectures and events with the attention that they wished they could. So we thought about what if we were to create a way to have people listen to this on their own time. They could listen to it in the morning, they could listen to it at any point because it's accessible, it is recorded, and maybe we can even give some insight to people who don't understand anything about architecture. We didn't realize how much this was going to grow in the beginning. So, in the beginning, our target was students.
We started off thinking that students would listen and maybe a few professionals or their friends. But over time, I started thinking about how we can make it so that people that don't know about design could actually learn about it. Because I always joked about if my mom can understand this, I think most people can understand this. Not in a bad way, but because we want it so that if you're not studying architecture but you have an interest in it, you can understand. Design in general feels very hard to understand sometimes because there's complicated words or different concepts that people don't talk about in everyday life. But we realized that by telling the story about the people, we were really not just talking about the design, but understanding why they designed the way they do and how they see it because of how they grew up or their backgrounds.
And when we tried to figure out what the name was going to be for this podcast, we knew we wanted to go beyond what we always saw, beyond their work, beyond the person who was always the face of what they were doing. And I think at one point, we were just having a conversation. I was just explaining what I hoped the podcast would end up becoming. And Kayla was like, beyond the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Alex had mentioned, oh, I want to see what they do, like who's the person behind their work. Like I want to know what's beyond the surface. And I was like, write that down. Like that's the perfect name. That's exactly what we're trying to do is we're trying to see who they are beyond the surface. What's behind the project, even behind the news article that you read. We realized also with the reason we liked podcasts is when we listen to lectures, we could see the slideshow, we could see all the work those architects had done before, but we realized that when they're presenting and we hear their voice, it gives a different emotion. So we realized that we couldn't just type out an interview and have that. Some people might want to read, but the fact that you could hear the voice of the people really helps get the emotion across in their story.
So we started as a podcast, and we were very selective with our first few guests because we felt like that was going to really shape the way that we wanted this podcast to be. And I know if anyone has listened to our first episode, it's a little bit different than what we currently do. And even our first few episodes are a little bit different. The formatting and the way that we talk, and we are younger, of course. But I think our first episode started when one time a late night in the architecture studio, talking with a friend, Jesus, who happened to be sharing his story. And we had just pretty much talked about this idea of a podcast, wanting to share people's stories. And I think upon hearing his story was like, this story needs to be told. And there are so many stories in this world that need to be told, that are inspiration, that are reasons that we keep doing design. And I just really loved his story. And I remember talking to him being like, would you be okay being the first person on our podcast? And would you be comfortable sharing your story?
And I remember Alex came to me after she heard that story and he's like, I have the perfect person. I was like, okay, who is it? She's like, Jesus. I'm like, okay, I've met him before, but I didn't know like his whole background. And she was like, well, you know, he's an older person. I'm like, yeah, he's in his 50s. And I was like, oh, yeah, I know he's in his 50s. And Alex started breaking it down. I was like, he was in the military and everything, but he always wanted to do architecture. And that really started the idea where people love design, people love architecture, and you end up doing it at some point. And Jesus was the perfect story on somebody who persevered through everything and really made it through school. So we talked to him and we just set up a time to meet with him before recording. We wanted to really set up how we wanted to record since it was our first episode. And we also knew he had a really big story and a lot of things to tell. So we wanted to just sit down and talk to him so he was comfortable. We knew what he wanted to talk about or was okay talking about, but also just so we could get to know him in things that we weren't going to record so that we really understood who he was. And then we set up a time to record with him.
Yeah, it was definitely a different format because we were also trying to figure out what the format of future episodes was going to be, the introduction to the podcast. It was a lot more work. Even, I mean, we didn't talk about this, but even finding where we were going to record was also another thing. And luckily, we did come across WIT, which offers a radio station, especially for students, to be able to record, and that's what we were able to use while we were in school, and we still use it sometimes even now.
WIT was very helpful. The fact that there was a the fact that there was a recording station and radio on campus really helped out because they had students that were running it as well, and we were able to ask them questions about using their technology and what would happen if we kept going and graduated. And we were really lucky that we were able to get it all set up and we've been able to record in the station. So that was how we started off. We had Jesus as our first guest, and then the following guests, we really tried to start with the network that we had, especially since it was near the end of the school year and we wanted it to carry through the summer. We didn't want to lose momentum even during the summer. So we really reached out to personal network first and then we started expanding it as time went on.
Yes, I remember the first few people were people we felt closest to, especially in the network, or people that we did look up to. Most of these people we met through INOMA, participating with INOMA, participating with AIA Chicago, and they were people we looked up to and we wanted to know the story behind. The way that we created our episodes were very different than we do now. I remember in the beginning, we always brought a topic. We always had a topic that we wanted to talk about. So, for example, I think Davy, we were thinking about the effect urbanism has on the city as a whole, and then also his career also as an artist as well as a designer. And when we were talking about that, we would just be like, oh, well, Davey's the right person. So we always started with the topic versus now we actually start with the person and let the topic develop itself. So that's one way that our podcast format has changed a little bit throughout the time.
The format has definitely changed for the better because we started meeting so many different types of people that we didn't want to pinhole people into just one subject. We actually wanted to get their story and then see where their interests lie, and we thought that would develop more organically. Following the summer, we had gotten all these episodes, and then there was a event at Crown one time. There was an event at Crown Hall one time. It was a lecture, and partway through the lecture, Maurice Cox came in, and he had just finished his term as the commissioner for the city of Chicago's Department of Planning. And I remember recognizing him from a lecture and event that Alex and Nomas had put on. So after the lecture, he had just happened to be attending. He wasn't even the speaker. I went up to him and I introduced myself and I was like, I think I've met you before, but we started a podcast at the end of the last school year. Could we have you on our show? And he agreed. And that kind of surprised me, not in the way that I didn't expect him to say yes, but because he said, email me, call me, find a time, and we'll make it work out. And we managed to get his episode ready. And I think we had also recorded with Ernie Wong around the same time. And doing research into Ernie, I realized that we had actually been taught some of his father's work and the work that his father had done with Mies in our history classes. And as I did more research, I found out that Ernie's firm, Site Design Group, had done parks in Chinatown and Bridgeport that I had personally gone to. So getting to that point where I realized, oh, we're interviewing somebody that's done all this work. We're interviewing Maurice Cox, who had such an important position. And just looking at all the really interesting people we started meeting, we realized that getting the person and their story would actually unlock so much potential to see the type of work they did and how that work actually came about. And that's probably when we really felt the podcast taking off. That's when we really felt the podcast taking off, and we were really excited and we started planning so many new things with our guests and just trying to grow because we wanted not just students to hear it at that point. We really wanted professionals to also hear from people that are in the industry that they might not have had conversations with, even if they really do appreciate the work that they've done.
Yes. I remember in the beginning, most of our episodes were, I would say they were more about mentorship, but I think that was because that was the relationship we had with our guests. Yes, we still got behind who they were and we still were able to get their stories told, so we were really happy with that. But I feel like after Maurice Cox and Ernie, that's when it became welcome into the design industry. Some of our listeners are no longer students. That's when we had to really take a different approach to how we were approaching even getting our guests. We started going to a lot more events, and I feel like it became easier to have more of a reason to network. In the beginning, when we networked, there was more for personal reasons, to know people at different firms. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that side of networking, but now we were networking with a purpose. We felt good. Every single time we walked in the room, we were like, we're the podcast crew. So it was different. We were able to bring in conversations, talk about ourselves, create a name for ourselves, but also learn a lot more because people were very welcoming to students who were ambitious starting a podcast. And a lot of them were actually really happy to give us feedback. I remember one person who gave us feedback was Iker Gill from Mass Context. I was able to speak with him a few weeks before we even had started Beyond the Surface. And I remember I had gone with my dean, Reed Koloff, to a Mass Context event, and Iker was there, and I was like, is there anyone here who could give me advice on how to start a podcast? And he was like, I know the right person. And he's like, go to Iker Gill and talk to him. And I remember that conversation really did push forward what we have now, Beyond the Surface.
And when Alex was talking about growth, it also reminded me that when we realized that more professionals were also listening, we needed to market differently. And I was fortunate to actually have a roommate and a friend that was living with me, Jalise Ahmed. He does all our visuals now. And at the time, I was telling him about the podcast, and he had sort of listened to it, but he also saw me editing, and he was very interested in graphic design. So he just offered to do graphics with us. And as we started interviewing more people, he also became more excited. He realized that a lot of our guests were really cool and he was enjoying just being in the room when we were interviewing, even if he wasn't talking. So the graphic side of it really helped out. And then coincidentally, at the same time that Alex and I were doing the podcast, we had both become presidents in the student organizations at school. I had become the AIAS, so American Institute of Architecture Students, the AIAS president at IIT, and she had been in NOMAS for so long, she ended up being one of the presidents for NOMAS. So it all converged where we had the podcast, the student orgs, and other people around us that were really supportive. It was our guests, it was our friends, it was even just the administration at school. The fact that the College of Architecture would see it and sometimes they would help us market just by in their normal newsletters or telling students about it, or we could hang up the flyers and they wouldn't take it down. It was really great to just see everyone around us being supportive. And as we got to know more people, we reached out and started making lists of people that we wanted to target and also just taking feedback from our guests. will interview somebody and then ask, oh, who's somebody you want to hear from? It could be your friend or somebody that you feel like you want to know more about. And that started a really fun dynamic where we would start researching somebody and then somebody would suggest them and then I would tell them, oh, that's somebody I actually found out about. Could you help us with contacting them? So it became a really fun thread to pull whenever we found somebody interesting. We'd have to find a way to contact them, whether it was just digging around the internet and LinkedIn and everything to contact them, or to have a previous guest recommend and get us connected. So just scheduling that all out has been a really big challenge, but also very fun because we got to see how our network grew and our listeners grew. And we hit a point where sometimes we'd reach out to somebody and they would actually tell us, oh, I've listened to your show. And we really appreciated that because then we were able to actually build the format with our guests. We were able to change how the conversations went over time. Instead of being super structured, Alex was able to start flowing with the conversation more, and she can definitely talk about that.
Yes, I remember in the beginning we always had like these more strict questions, and I think what was challenging for me was always the responding back. I would even say it's still a challenge. I'm still learning as I go. But in the beginning it was pretty hard because it's like an interview but a conversation at the same time. But when it was too formatted, it felt more like an interview that I was trying really hard to make a conversation. So over time, we try to make it a little bit more flexible, more open in the air so that we could really make this more of a conversation. And it's really funny to see that the recording process is definitely not how the final always comes out. The recording process actually has a lot more conversation in the background, a lot more pauses. Sometimes, since everything's very open, it can sometimes be challenging for me to think of a response really quickly because when I'm thinking of response, I'm also thinking of what the next question is going to be. And we do have topics written down. It's not as open. But I think that was one of the things, just learning how to be a host was a really cool experience. And I do want to give Caleb a shout out. Like, he was the producer, the editor, the researcher, all in one, really taking a lot of time to put into the podcast. And he learned all the softwares and everything about everyone who we were going to record, where we were going to record, coordinating everything. And we both found that it's yes, but he did put a lot of work into this as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think you joke about the pauses. I think one compliment I got that they didn't realize was a compliment from a guest was we were recording and we're in between questions and pauses and the three of us were just discussing what the next question or the response would be and the guest just looked at me and was like, you edit really well. I didn't realize you guys had so much time in between questions. And I felt really happy because it made me realize that we did have a really polished product, that not only did the guest feel happy to be included in the actual question generation and the conversation, it pushed us to understand that it was a conversation. It's not an interview where you're given a set of questions that you have to answer that's really rigid. We really wanted to become flexible with the guest. So even when I contact guests or talk to them, I say it's a conversation and our host will adjust. Alex will make sure that the conversation goes with what you're talking about because we didn't want it to feel like we were imposing a specific topic on the guest. We wanted them to give us feedback as they're talking. We would research a bunch about them, and that also helped because then we would know the type of work they've done, or sometimes we found other interviews they had done in the past. But we really wanted to make sure that we got information on them that we wanted to learn more about. But then the conversation always develops, and that's what makes the podcast really fun.
I would also say you can't find everything on your guest online. And I mean, that's a given. That'd be a little bit creepy. You can't find everything. So a lot of our questions, especially in the beginning, is like, what is your background? Well, I can't find how many siblings they had or necessarily who their parents are online. But there's a lot of questions that you won't know the response to. One interesting thing about certain questions, for example, we always ask, what is your background? Some people end up talking about architecture right away, and some people end up talking about their family right away. I feel like that's always such a unique question because it's the thing that defines you. It can be your childhood, it could be the moment you thought you were going to do architecture, it could be a college thing, and everybody responds to it differently. And because of that, we can't always have everything super structured, because the first question could be, what is your background? And then they talk about their family. And then I'm just like, what was your early career like? And it was like, that didn't connect. So definitely like really learning how to have these conversations, what questions to ask, has been a major part of our growth. And there is a lot more pauses in the actual recording process that we don't always show.
Talking to our guests about their identity really helped us think about what we wanted to talk about. And as we got towards the end of our academic career, when we were about to graduate, we actually had a student reach out to us. And he was a first year student, Eric. And he just said, I found out about your podcast. I want to learn more. Could I get involved? And around that time, we were already thinking about how to continue the podcast. And as we grew our team, it helped us redefine and rethink what we were doing. And after we graduated, we thought about stuff over the summer, and then we decided to continue. But we also wanted to grow the team even more. We wanted to make sure that our full-time jobs and the podcast, and even Eric as a student, like everyone was able to put in time that they felt was right, but also that we could actually create a quality product that we were proud of. So we started recruiting other people, and one of our classmates, Emily Yao, we knew that she would be really interested in the podcast because she had listened before, but she was also very ambitious when it came to networking and getting to know people and understanding architecture. And she also had a friend, Chelsea, that we knew, who was very good with social media. So we started expanding our team so that instead of just me and Alex, two of us, we had third person Jaleese, then Eric, Chelsea, and Emily. It expanded our team to a point where I didn't have to take on everything and Alex didn't have to take on everything. We could all distribute our roles and support each other. And it would help the conversations we had, since now we each brought a different perspective into the conversation, that when we're formulating ideas for guests or formulating even the types of things we want to talk about, now we had more voices and more perspectives that really shape how we have grown.
When we originally started the podcast, I don't think we ever thought we were going to continue it past graduation. I remember originally, a few years into the podcast, we kept trying to get people to join the podcast. We kept trying to recruit. We were hoping that maybe eventually that we would train a new host and then leave it with Nomas. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And there were people interested, but there wasn't that many people who wanted to fully commit. And that's when, yes, we came across Eric, and it was good to have like a 4-person team before we graduated. But after we graduated, we were like, okay, are we going to keep this? And I think even some of our listeners at one point, they had told us too, oh, I thought you guys were going to end it after you guys graduated. And we really had to like consider, are we going to keep it? Are we not going to keep it? And I think we really liked the work that we were doing. By this point, we had already worked at internships, and we knew that architecture is very different when you leave school, because in school you're constantly thinking about these ideas, constantly challenging architecture, building models, crazy things that wouldn't be built. And it's very different when you enter the work environment. I know for the first few years, a lot of people, they're mainly just still picking up the technical skills, trying to get licensed. You're not expected to do the work you want to do when you first leave school. And even then, if you end up doing it, good for you, but that is not the case for many people. And so we were like, I think it's important that we keep this. I think it's important for ourselves, and it's important for other people as well. It it really gives an insight to people who are in the field still doing the work that we hoped to do when we were students. And I feel like it's going to keep us ambitious, like our personal selves. It would keep us ambitious to continue doing the work that we want to do, even if we're not going to be doing it in that exact moment. And I feel like there was a few other people who did grow up with the podcast, having it in school, and it would also be helpful for them to also being able to continue knowing that, yeah, we might not be doing the exact things in school that we hoped for, but I mean, there is still someone that we're talking to that is doing this work, which means that we can still do this work in the future. So I think that was really important for us too.
Yeah, and continuing the podcast, I realized that Alex has a very unique voice when she talks, and people like listening to how she speaks and tells the story. Continuing the podcast, I realized that Alex was the host, but she was also framing conversations. Certain times when she was talking about her personal experience, you could tell that she was learning with the guest or she was seeing things differently because she was a student, I was a student. But over time, you could start seeing how the podcast really helped us form some beliefs for ourselves. And we also realized that sometimes students don't see the side when you first graduate. Like Alex said, you might not be doing what you're interested right away. You might be doing some stuff that you expected, but there's going to be a lot of unexpected things. And we realized that our conversations with guests would also talk about some of that. Just by the personal experiences that Alex was having, she would be learning from the guest and talking to them, and her perspective would be shifting from what students see to early career professionals. And as the podcast continues, it will also be a reflection of the type of experiences I have had, she has had, and the rest of our team has had. Because the conversations we have reflect our guests, but also who we are as the presenters or the podcast team.
I think one cool thing about the podcast that I've seen over the time is the impact. Hearing people talk about the podcast, even having people come up to me and be like, "Oh, I recognize your voice," has been really cool. But not just that, but also hearing students be like, "I never thought about design that way." And people saying like, "Oh, I listen to your podcast because it helps me do this and that. It helps me really think about the world differently, know what the industry is going to look like in the next coming years." It has helped people understand architecture, but also be ambitious and honestly do more things than we originally thought. Because again, I mainly wanted this podcast to be able to storytell and help me know what was coming next in my career. But yes, if we were to do this all over, Caleb, what advice would you give yourself?
I knew this question was coming and it's still really tough to think about. I think part of the biggest things was just we learned so much over time, and I think one of the things that we learned actually was to just be ourselves. When we first started, we were nervous about how we were going to present or talk, and we made it actually too rigid for ourselves. And I think if I was to give myself advice, or even anyone that is nervous about networking, talking to people, it is just to try to loosen up and understand that the people you're talking to were students at one point, they were early career professionals at one point. It's interesting to even see that we've had guests that we interview tell us that they didn't know things about the other guests that we've interviewed. And those are people that they see as mentors or even coworkers and friends. So I think that's the biggest advice that I've seen in general, not just for what we would have done differently, but I think makes sense is be yourself because people understand that you're learning, but if you're ambitious and you show it or you're interested in something and you want to learn more about it, there's going to be somebody there. And I think that's what I appreciate about the podcast. Like you said, people have told us that they listen to it and they enjoy it. But even if people didn't tell me that, I got to enjoy a great conversation with a guest. Even if I was worried, oh, they're not going to listen to this episode. No, people listen to it, but I also got to enjoy editing and listening to the guest tell us stories.
I think there would be two things that I would also add on to that. Well, as a host, I feel like I didn't always do my job the best. And I only say this because one of the things I wish I would have done is actually listen to more podcasts. So I mainly grew up in a church and I did a lot of public speaking. I actually used to preach at one point, which is a funny story, but we won't get into there, of course. So I feel like that was a different type of dialogue than what I was used to. I was very used to telling stories. I used to tell my siblings stories ever since they were kids, especially to help them go to sleep. And so I feel like I was always a natural born leader, a natural born storyteller. But it was very different when it came to helping someone be comfortable telling their own story and learning how to create conversations. I realized podcasting is way more than just an interview. It's way more than just storytelling. It's a conversation. And I wish I would have known that a little bit sooner because I probably would have approached things a little bit differently. I realize I'm not that great at conversations because I don't always know how to respond. I don't always know what to say. I can get shy. And so I feel like that would have helped me to be aware of that. A more advice that I would say would be networking. I feel like networking was a huge thing when it came to the podcast but I think it goes hand in hand with the conversations. Putting yourself out there was probably the hardest thing I had to do in the podcast. I may not always come off as that, and I know a lot of people listening to this who do know me might be like, you always seem to be natural. Well, it was all pretend. But I think sometimes that's what you have to do when it comes to networking. You have to fake it till you make it. In the beginning, especially, I was very nervous. I could not enter a room of professionals without Caleb next to me. When he would leave to talk to someone, I'd be like, wait, I don't even know where I am. So I think really being able to bring myself out of that shell and being able to communicate with other people was something that changed not just myself as a podcast host, but myself as a designer. It helped me with my career, and I would just say, like, I feel like there is an importance to networking and creating those bonds that are more than just a LinkedIn profile. So I would just say, like, really learn how to have conversations and build those connections, because those connections can end up as friends too, or just people that you end up being able to sit down and learn their entire story of through a recorded conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to talk about the podcast is we get to meet really interesting people and we share their conversations with our listeners. I really appreciate the people that take the time to talk to us and the people that take the time to listen because they go hand in hand. We get to find these amazing people that have these incredible stories and really cool projects, and everything they talk about is really important. But without the listeners, it really doesn't go very far aside from something that we talked about. But we've seen so much growth in the podcast and we're really happy. Just understanding that our team has grown, our listeners have grown. We've even gotten listeners from other countries outside the US. So we really want to just continue growing the podcast and making it so that the stories get heard. But I've been really grateful to have these conversations and I hope to continue them because I really enjoy these conversations, and editing them really has shown me the power of storytelling because some people really have a lot to say, and it's really cool to see like how people communicate.
Some of the things that we're thinking about in the future, just a little sneak peek. I won't say too much, but there are still some goals that we are trying to meet. Hopefully, beyond the surface, we'll end up growing. And I think one of the things we're pushing towards is more of a variety of the type of episodes we want to do. Maybe exploring a little bit more of the design aspects. So I did want to share that with everyone. I think that's appropriate to be shared. And a few other things is just really honing into the different things that can be done with architecture, different design ideas, and really starting to question them. We've had so many conversations with our guests who've had many different ideas, and I think we would like to start making different types of episodes where maybe we just talk a little bit more about those ideas and talk a little bit more about our takeaways on those ideas. We look forward to those episodes coming out in the future. Another thing that we want to do is pretty much just grow in general. We want to keep getting people's voices heard. We want to make it so that we could interview more people globally. We want to make it so we can interview more people, even just in general. So I think in general, we're looking for a lot of growth in the future.
I'm excited for everyone to see what we come up with in the future, and also I am looking forward to the future and the types of episodes that we present to everyone. But I'm also excited that our team has grown because we're all interested in so many topics that we have new ideas on how to present these ideas and tell stories about design and tell stories about the people behind the design. And I think that's really how our mission has grown. It isn't just about the individual people behind the design, it's about how design is shaping the world and how the people and their personalities and backgrounds are influencing how everything comes together. So we're really excited to continue telling these great stories and having amazing guests on. So thank you.
To end our episode, I did want to give everybody a huge thanks. First to our guests for being patient with me behind the mic. No, I'm just kidding. But please keep that in. I feel like they have really shaped what this podcast is. And I've had a lot of growth in general, just being on the podcast, being able to be a better host because of their feedback, because the way that they help also shape these conversations. Like, this is really amazing to be able to continue this podcast when it just started with one conversation, one idea, and it's grown so much. So, yeah, thank you to our guests who've been on this podcast and the future ones that are to come who will continue to support this mission. And to our listeners, thank you because you guys made this podcast possible. You guys really kept motivating us to keep going, to really shape these conversations, really telling us what you guys wanted to hear. And it really helped us be able to grow as a podcast. Because trust me, I didn't know what I was doing. Caleb didn't know what he was doing. And we had to train everybody who was coming into the podcast. So it's always really nice to know that you guys continue to listen to us. It's always nice to know that you guys consider this podcast as worth listening to. Feel free to contact us whenever. We would love to hear you guys' feedback on what you guys think about the podcast, anyone else that you guys want to hear. We've already had a few emails at this point, and our emails is located on our website, which is beyondthesurfacepodcast.org. You guys can also keep up with our episodes on that website as well. I want to thank everybody for listening. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform. You can follow us on Instagram at beyondthesurface_design pod or visit our website at beyondthesurfacepodcast.org. I want to thank our producer, Kwok, and the entire Beyond the Surface team and those who have joined us over the time for making this podcast possible. Thank you all for listening to this very special episode of Beyond the Surface. Until next time, goodbye.